Hello, all you dreamers, optimists, and junior tomorrownauts. Welcome back to the Tomorrowland Times podcast, the unofficial home for fans of Disney's 2015 Tomorrowland movie, its prequel novel, Before Tomorrowland, and the alternate reality game that introduced us to its fictional universe all the way back in 2013, The Optimist. I'm Hastin.
And I'm Nick, and today we're concluding our limited series on the show, the Before Tomorrowland Book Club, celebrating the 10th anniversary of the prequel novel written by Jeff Jensen and Jonathan Case. Welcome, one and all, to the spectacular Before Tomorrowland Book Club
Anniversary special celebration.
Released 10 years ago on this very day, Hastin, April 7th, 2015. And what a decade it has been. To honor this milestone, we're going to take a look behind the scenes of its creation. But first, Hastin, I would like to take the opportunity to explore some of the topics that didn't fit within the shackles of our previous chapter breakdowns in the series. So let's dive into the Plus Ultra archive and imagine what might have been and what might still be. And what might still be for a lot of folks is they're ordering the 10th anniversary pin. We showed it off. We announced it in the last episode. Sales are going well. We got about half of our stock left. So if you want one, you better get it fast. So this week I'll show you. I didn't show this in any of the other materials. So this is a anniversary special exclusive. This is the box that it comes in, emblazoned with the Plus Ultra logo. And you just take that right off and you see the beautiful 10th anniversary pin beneath. So don't miss your chance to celebrate a decade of optimism with the Tomorrowland Times 10th anniversary pin. Available now for a limited time in limited quantities.
And I said it last week, but Nick really outdid himself on this one. Like, it is just so great to finally have that 1964 size, colored pin, and then the bonus 10th anniversary layered pin design. Oh, it's just genius. It is just genius.
Thank you very much, sir. And it's a great way for optimists to identify themselves when they're walking around town. You see this puppy on them and oh, this person's in the know. This person knows all about the future. And it can strike up some good conversations. Don't underestimate the ability of this pin to be a good conversation starter. Much like the ripping conversation that we're going to have today, Hastin, I thought we'd start with a fun one. Let's think about fandom futures before Tomorrowland, not just the movie, the book. Let's think about, what do we want to see from the fans? Because yes, there's two of us sitting here. We talk to each other like this at least once a year. And the other fans can also contribute in ways that will delight the two of us. I'd like to see some fan fiction. So the question I'll place to you is, what sort of opportunities for fan fiction would you like to see expanded or explored in the future?
I would love to see what happened during the war. What happened during World War II, actually. Like, what does a lockdown, non-functioning, non-wanting to explore version of Plus Ultra look like? What is maintenance mode Plus Ultra?
Right. And I mean, the beauty of that, obviously, the two of us are biased because most of the members are doing nothing. They're holed down doing whatever history says they were actually doing at the time until Walt Disney shows up and kind of reinvigorates the mid-century Plus Ultra. That means if you told a fan fiction story during the war, during this period, Amelia Earhart would be front and center. Because she has been given a very specific job, right? She is responsible for plugging up all the holes, shutting down all of the different hubs all over, and you bet some of those might be a little resistant to being shut down. She's going to have to tell them the news, convince them. I'd say an Amelia Earhart focused fan fiction is just a great opportunity to inject some fun. So if anyone wants to write that, if you have a real calling for the voice of Amelia Earhart, give it a write. Upload it up to AO3, an archive of our own with all the other great fan fiction. And that's a great example because there's a couple different types of fan fiction that are the broad categories. And that's a good example of one. Gaps you want to see filled.
Absolutely.
There are these holes in the story that you can fill because we only have so much knowledge of the timeline of Plus Ultra. There are just infinite possibilities to fill in those gaps. Decades and decades worth of storytelling that we might never get in an official way, but the fans can absolutely take on. And you never know, if a piece of fan fiction is popular enough, it might just be accepted as headcanon by the whole fandom. So I definitely encourage people to do that. Now, other than Amelia, because obviously we love Amelia, are there any other characters that we would like to see get their own spin-off? And I mean, I guess this is going to go for fan fiction or official stuff, but let's take Amelia off the table because we just gave her this one. If we're studio heads or we're, entertainment executives at a book company, what other, I'm going to say specifically Before Tomorrowland characters do we think could sustain their own spin-off story? Any media, any media.
A Faustus animated series.
Absolutely. I mean, and the good thing is you could do each episode from the perspective of a different
Yeah,
Faustus.
exactly.
This fits directly into the mold. In the Star Wars universe, this show is called Bad Batch, which is all about the clones, and all the clones are voiced by the same guy. So you just got to hire one actor to play all the Faustus units. You get him in a booth, and he records all the episodes in one day. It's fantastic and a great cost savings. I love that. My answer for this one, I think I would love. I know it would probably dovetail a lot with Amelia, but getting a glimpse into post Before Tomorrowland, Lee Brackett on the medical side of things. The idea of Lee as a doctor, I'm going to say you could even fill in that gap between the actual end of Before Tomorrowland and the epilogue, because there's a huge gap of time. How did what does it mean to train as a plus ultra doctor for those years? And then also during those fallow years, I assume he follows Amelia. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he's off doing his own thing. But specifically, futurism as seen through the medical lens is a very interesting one. You've got your Dr. McCoys, you've got your Star Trek versions of that, but what is the Tomorrowland version of a sci-fi doctor? That would be a very interesting story. And I remember when we were able to talk to Jeff Jensen, he was always thinking about on his own, outside of the context of the collaboration with the rest of the filmmakers, when we asked him what Tomorrowland 2 might look like for him, he always talked about this idea of the reverse robot revolution, where the plus ultra robots just drop rather than attacking humanity, are helping humanity. The humanity expects the robots to attack, but they actually help. And one of the examples he gave was to like just go into an urban center and drop like a hospital, like a futuristic hospital type thing. And it's like that feels like something that could have been spearheaded by Lee Brackett, if you ask me. So that would be amazing. Let's hone down in on this though. Let's talk time periods. You were talking about that war time period. Are there any other specific eras that strike us around or complementary to Before Tomorrowland that might be fun to explore in fan fiction? Assuming some of these characters survive into the resurgence of plus ultra, you've already mentioned the idea of going into those war eras, but in the mid-century era, in the time surrounding the World's Fair in 64, where they're planning for the big reveal in 84, it would kind of be interesting to get a boots on the ground sort or fly on the wall look at what those discussions were. So if it was perhaps through a character like Lee, who would at that point be middle-aged.
Maybe you've got this whole story with Lee where he's become disillusioned with like how Nix wants to lead. Is Nix even a leader when we see him at the World's Fair? We assume that he's maybe not, and then he becomes a leader by the time 2014 hits, but like maybe he's actually a higher up person, or maybe he's a massive micromanager, and that's what leads Tomorrowland to failing. And
I mean, if we know Frank gets kicked out in 84, I think it's very safe to assume that Nix has taken power by 84, and he is the reason the reveal doesn't happen that time. So it would be very interesting to see how, if Lee is sort of, let's say, 84, he'll be an older guy. He'll be in his elder years. What would Lee's view on what Nix is doing? And he could make these parallels to thinking about we could have flashbacks to more interesting anecdotes about his mom and Amelia and all these other relationships he's had, but through the lens of him watching plus ultra fall again, this thing that he's kind of invested his whole life into. That's a great idea. Yeah, obviously we've spitballed just a few ideas. There are infinite ideas for fan fiction. I want to talk about fan art now, because one of the things that we kind of earmarked in our previous episodes is something that would be fun to talk about here in the anniversary celebration. We got all these fantastic pieces of chapter art by Jonathan Case. But what were the things specifically from Before Tomorrowland that never got illustrated by Jonathan Case? What are the things that still live in the imagination that might just be great to see fan art trying to take a stab? What are the characters, objects, and locations that were never illustrated that we would love to see? What comes to mind?
I think for me, it's the Hall of the Future at the New Yorker Hotel.
Yeah, especially just to get a sense of the square footage.
Right. We know how big it is.
Theoretic, is it?
No,
Is
it's
it?
probably not that big. Combination steampunk slash, Art Deco kind of era, I think combined with those sort of New York values that I think would be really, really a lot of fun. I mean, obviously, the full airship and a full tour of the airship would be amazing. We get that single, drawing that Jonathan did on the side with with Tesla, but like, wouldn't it be great to see what this giant invisible airship actually looked like?
I mean, just a cross section, like a Wes Anderson cross section of the airship would be amazing. We could see all the little levels and all the little offices because you do get, you get a description of sort of the main area and what it looks like. But let's take a look at it on that level. I'd also, as much as we see the one we and I debated if it was or wasn't the one shot of Tesla holding same picture you're describing, him holding the MFD. I'd love to have some fan illustrations of looking at an MFD device as described in the book, folding and kind of, it could be a very interesting piece of retro future technology. Hey, if anyone out there wants to practice being a prop designer, give it a stab. Let us see it. Let us know what you think the MFD should look like. Now, Haston, one character that comes up a lot for us that I realized as I was going through all the illustrations, we never get a picture of. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think Jonathan ever drew a Faustus.
No, we never got a Faustus unit. No.
We get a description, but we don't get a picture. And it's like, I'm imagining we're all kind of casting a different person, but it's there's that question of how human did they actually look? Because the robots in Tomorrowland all generally look very human. But like when they describe the skin as being sort of metallic, do they mean literally? Like, because then everyone would just think they're wearing makeup. I'm imagining it was more like a subtle sheen, like there was just like they were glowing a little bit or something like that, right? Like I would be very curious to see what people think a
And
Faustus
how
looks
human
like
did they act? And did they walk? And did they
as an early unit. I mean, because obviously, just based on the action that we see depicted, even Henry is mistaken as a human by normal people who know it, until he gets damaged. So we're still very much dealing in the waters of like the Gurns box in the movie and Athena, where it's like, yeah, they're people. They just look like people. They're played by actors. So who would we cast as Faustus?
Ooh,
Throwing it out
who
to
would we cast as Faustus?
it's a tough one, man. It could go a lot of different ways. I mean, and I'm not. Hey, I know we talked about this last time. I'm not ruling out that it just looks like Wallace. I'm telling you, I think Wallace could be a leftover Faustus that got out of the incinerator.
What a great story for somebody to write.
Yeah, anyone that wants to write things that bridge the Optimist and Before Tomorrowland. Look, you and I carried the torch of doing fan fiction that bridged the Optimist and the movie, but go in the other direction. I'd love someone else to tie the little loops. Now, that being said, obviously, as we discussed throughout our episodes, a lot of our assumptions about Before Tomorrowland were based on the advanced reader copy, and indeed, we did seed a few of the documents because one of the big things about Stop Plus Ultra is we made this Plus Ultra archive website where you could pull up member files with a bunch of things, and we filled those with very interesting things. Some of those were inspired by what we read in the early copy, and one of them was this telegram in the style of the telegrams from the Optimist, but an earlier version between Tesla and Amelia. And that was always one of my favorite little things that we came up with because it was sort of making explicit the sort of heartfelt connection that they had. I consider that a piece of fan fiction, but that was like 2 sentences. I think someone could write a whole full thing, not just an artifact like we did, but a whole fleshed out story.
I would love to see somebody tackle that whole arrival experience and the whole puzzle and everything else at Wardenclyffe. Like, I just imagine this, like the light up tiles and like what did that look like? How did that open? I just imagine the like giant thing lighting up or something.
Imagine the version in the book, and then imagine the version that the Faustus had originally planned before they identified Lee, because there was going to be the version of the puzzle that was for everybody,
Right.
and then they changed it. What was that going to be? Hey, you don't have to just be a writer or an artist to engage in fan fiction. Fan fiction can take many forms. If you're a puzzle designer, you can design a new puzzle for what would have been there. I'm always encouraging people. This was actually the thrust of the last year at HalseyCon. I did a panel, and the thrust of this was kind of trying to help people broaden their expectations of what fan fiction can look like. We live in a digital age. We live in an interactive age. Let yourself think about what type of things can be fan fiction. Cosplay can be fan fiction. The idea of you're not just replicating something, but you're actually putting two things together in the fictions that have never been put together before. You can be a walking piece of fan fiction. You can make a sculpture. You can make an interactive thing. You can make a website. You can make a fictional social media account. You got to be very careful with those, but it can be done. Broaden your horizons, and just like the fine ambitions of this book, allow yourself to take inspiration from how ambitious they were with this prequel, with your own fandom explorations of this prequel. And speaking of that ambition, Hastin, I thought it would be great for us to peel back the curtain a little bit and look behind the scenes of the making of this book, because way back in 2016,
9 years ago. 9 years ago. I can't believe it.
what was originally planned to be the first anniversary audio commentary, where we were going to, you and I both talk over the film and then cut to interviews we had done with Brad Bird, Damon Lindelof, Jeff Jensen, and all the people who worked on the movie. Even Athena and young Frank were in that commentary with us. That was delayed till the second anniversary, but we did all of the interviews in 2016. And obviously, when you're cutting interviews up against a 2-hour film, there's only so much that can make it. And quite frankly, a lot of the Before Tomorrowland stuff really just didn't have a place to go in that commentary. So I thought, how great would it be for us to go back and remember some of the things that we had asked Jeff Jensen when the book was quite fresh on our minds, only a year out from the book's release. We sat down. I'll paint the picture for the audience. Hastin and I gathered at a little cafe in an undisclosed location in Southern California, where we met Jeff Jensen and asked him a few questions. The first one we asked him was about those initial ideas about building Plus Ultra's history and how those ideas predated even the book itself. Let's hear from Jeff Jensen.
One of my jobs on the movie, once we had the story in place, was, okay, this is our movie, this is our story. Now, let's lock down the history of Plus Ultra that led up to the creation of Tomorrowland. I think that one of the things I'm really interested in, and I feel like I could be pretty good at, is creating, like looking to history, seeing moments of history, and then trying to create fiction that brings to life that part of the history. And so when I was asked to create sort of like the mythology of Tomorrowland leading up to the creation of Tomorrowland, I didn't just think in terms of milestones, like who was in Plus Ultra at this time and what did they develop. I thought about story. So whenever there was like a big flashpoint of history, I would always include like a paragraph or a whole page of, here's the story of what happened in Plus Ultra at that time. And there were two stories in particular in our early history of Plus Ultra that I developed and pitched to Brad, and he loved. One was this idea that there was a decision made around 1939 to shut down Plus Ultra for a time because of the threat represented by Nazi Germany. And that the people that were part of Plus Ultra at the time would naturally be really interested in A, protecting their secrets from the Germans, but B, would be pretty like activated to fight Nazi Germany and help their countries defeat the Axis powers. And so there would be an idea of a suspending operation of Plus Ultra and people going their separate ways. And then this would lead to a fallow period, a dormant period in Plus Ultra's history throughout the 40s, in which Plus Ultra would go dormant before being reactivated in the early 50s with people like Walt. And so I pitched a story in that was essentially kind of that the idea that like Adolf Hitler would catch wind of Plus Ultra, would send agents to America to want to find secrets, to like gain access to it. And that story would ultimately be the catalyst for shutting down Plus Ultra, would be the catalyst for other things too, like building the atomic bomb, that kind of thing. Another story that I developed during that time, for that time period, would actually take place either right before the end of the war or right out. It was right around, it would be the mystery of Nikola Tesla's death, and the idea that Nikola Tesla's death was the result of people coming after him for his Plus Ultra secrets. And then that was a story that would involve like people like Amelia Earhart and sort of like trying to like get back from Nazis, but also the Soviets and even the early American intelligence. One of my jobs on the movie, once we had the story in place,
you can even hear it in his voice, like just having so much fun with it and how it turned into the stories that we read. Another thing too that just clicked with me, and I don't know why it just clicked with me. Maybe it was Jeff just describing it, but also this duality between Plus Ultra shutting down and everybody leaving and whatever else, and the film, and how that's basically happening in the film. It's like, oh, the monitor said there's this there's this destruction and there's this point of no return. Gather the humanity that we can, and we're just going to shut it down for a while and figure out what happens. I had never caught quite that duality before between the sort of end of the book and shutting down before the war, and then also the kind of shutdown that happens in the film.
Less optimistic shutdown in terms of who's leading Plus Ultra at the time, but definitely a parallel.
Right.
The thing that gets me about that, I love imagining this period where a lot of the main thrust of what would end up in the book were simply being built by Damon and Jeff as the necessary backstory of what was Plus Ultra doing at these pinch points in history, and the idea that the main threads of this book were originally quite separate things. These were separate ideas. There's this and this. Having read the book now, obviously, it all seems so naturally entwined. This is simply what happened. But the idea that they could have existed as completely separate stories, I think, speaks to how well the authors wove them into this single,
absolutely,
sort of inevitable story. And so let's hear Jeff talk about how the process of simply pitching to Brad and figuring out what Plus Ultra's in-universe history was, how did that become weaving them together into the form of something like a book?
In, I would say like fall of 2013, Disney Publishing approached us, wanting to partner with us and get us involved in creating some like publishing projects that would sort of like get outside the box of the usual movie publishing program of an adaptation and kids books and kids learning books. Could we do something special and unique for this movie? They brought me in and I talked to them about various things. I talked to them about the backstory that we had. We talked to them about these stories, and they loved the idea of maybe like bringing one of these stories to life as either a graphic novel or a novel. And I pitched them these two stories in particular. And the editors there said, well, we actually like both of them. And they love the idea of Amelia Earhart as like a heroine in this story. And so it's like, is there any way you can blend the two together? And I was like, yeah, I think so. And so that led to the book. And considerations like very, very early on, as I started thinking about the book and how to tell the story, I was kind of borrowing a little bit from like what we learned from the movie, but my own natural instincts, which is to say that a story into sort of like learning about the history of Plus Ultra should be told through people that didn't have any knowledge of Plus Ultra. And so they should, heroes then like Lee and his mom, Clara, kind of bumbling into a story in which they kind of like learn about the history of Plus Ultra, and they encounter Plus Ultra, and they encounter threats to Plus Ultra. That just seemed like a natural. And then kind of picking very specifically a date or a series of events that would be just perfect for bringing the themes and ideas of Plus Ultra to life. Well, this 4th of July weekend in 1939, where you have both the World's Fair taking place and that you have the first national Worldcon event. There had been kind of like smaller regional science fiction conventions leading up to that point, but this kind of represented a major national meeting of nascent sci-fi fandom at that time, taking place that weekend at a time when Albert Einstein is actually in real life vacationing on Mon Island and weighing and wrestling with matters of whether or not to like write a letter to Roosevelt. In, I would say, like fall of 2013, Disney Publishing approached us, wanting to partner with us and get us involved in creating some like publishing projects that would sort of like get outside the box of the usual movie publishing program of an adaptation and kids books and kids learning books. Could we do something special and unique for this movie?
It seems almost inevitable that it would have taken place on that weekend, but it's fascinating to hear him talk about the process of, look, we have this broad period of time we want to tell the story in. Can we cast a weekend? And it just so happened that there was this perfect little jewel.
How fun must have that exploring history been, and just finding all these things lining up that one weekend? I mean, I've definitely, since then have had that experience in my life of like, oh, you're doing some research and discover that all these things are interconnected, and like it's kind of the perfect story. And like, yeah, it's awesome that, that he would that it worked out that way. And that, again, we had the advantage of being able to play off this real weekend that happened, this real history, and be able to play with it in this world in such a fun and interesting way because of the effort that was made. And honestly, like, I think it's interesting because if you would have told 2016 Haston, I think I was thinking this at the time when he had mentioned like, oh, would have been, Disney came to us and said, we want to do something more with this. Well, first of all, 10 years later or 9 years later, that feels a little bit outside of the scope of what the company would do today. And second of all, I think that there was this idea of like, I was yearning for a graphic novel. When you say graphic novel, I'm like, oh, it should have been a graphic novel. But now that 9 years has elapsed and I've able to like come back and kind of accept it for what it is, and also like really enjoy it and really just consume it and go, oh, this is no longer this thing that I'm kind of like sad about because it happened and it wasn't a success. And like, I'm still dealing with kind of the reeling feeling from that. It's like, getting to sit down, enjoy this really meaty, very fun, very historical book made it so much more rewarding. And I'm so glad that we got this kind of like historical fiction mashed up two stories version of what happened. It also feels like such a fluke that this happened and that they had the research and that it's great.
Yeah, and thinking to the sort of inevitability of it all, in a chaotic world, it it's nice when you can look at something and say, "Man, it was really sort of meant to be in a way." All the little pieces coming together because it was a chaotic thing. It was from the mere marginalia of the brainstorming of the film that they said, we have enough material that you could do something like this. So when the opportunity comes up and, oh, it should be this period. And then they ask if you can combine these two stories together. And we say, okay, well, when would it take place? And there's just these perfect answers. There's an inevitable feeling about it that's very satisfying to look back on. And, every creative project has behind the scenes drama and developmental shenanigans that ultimately result in it being whatever the thing it is. But from the outside, just looking at it as a finished piece, you can appreciate this was what the world wanted this to be, even if it isn't always necessarily what the creators thought it would be. Calling back to our conversation with Brad Bird at the time, which we've written about extensively, he talks about you can go in with a plan for what was going to work on the screen 3 years after you get the green light, but the movie is going to tell you what it wants to be. And you can either fight the movie or you can work with it and say, okay, if that's what it's telling me, what can I do? And so while Tomorrowland itself might not even be the movie that Brad Bird set out to do, it is the movie that it told him it wanted to be. And I'd like to think it was probably the same thing through this book, through multiple iterations. And as we talked about in the previous episodes, all the different little adjustments and changes that went into it, we just now have this thing that feels Like it was always what it was meant to be. And it's nice to look back at something that feels that way. Now, of course, back in 2016, Haston, there was one thing in our minds. So, what did we ask Jeff Jensen about? We wanted to know about the connections with the movie. And I was so bold as to just come out the gate and ask him about the ending and the idea of Tomorrowland, the city, having been first dreamed by Clara. So, we asked Jeff about the process.
There's no process. That was just me and Jonathan. Jonathan Case, my co-writer on the book, who came aboard, and he drew a graphic novel that I wrote about my dad, and we have a good creative collaboration. And I brought him aboard at a time where it looked like that I was going to have some problems finishing the book. That was just a call that I made unilaterally. All of my considerations for the book regarding mythology were all in service of the movie. Like, I didn't want to do anything that contradicted the movie, but I also wanted to put stuff in the book that might be able to help explain some of the movie. So, for example, the wire transfer technology that you see in the movie, this sort of like wire-based teleportation system that Plus Ultra like had, I wanted the book to explain where that technology came from and kind of like capture your imagination for what its utility was in the world of Plus Ultra. The book ends with this implication that the dream of Tomorrowland, this sort of city of the future built in this parallel dimension, the seeds of it like resided with a dreamer, a woman, Clara, who had sketched and imagined what the city could possibly look like. Maybe a first stab at it was undertaken by this robot, this cyborg that got stranded and castawayed, marooned in Tomorrowland. That was how I rationalized that, how I was going to sell that to Damon and Brad if they were ever going to be like, you did what? In my view, that if you explored the parallel dimension of Tomorrowland, you might find actually vestiges of earlier attempts to build Tomorrowland, rough drafts of Tomorrowland, if you will. Site A, Site B, Site C. And I think and maybe even kind of like functioning metropolises that are part of a larger Tomorrowland complex of interconnected cities. And so that was kind of like my rationalization for the end of the book, is that kind of represented like some early rough draft stabs at the project that would become the Tomorrowland that you see in the movie.
There is no process. It's just doing the work. And isn't that a lesson for us all? It's just what the job was, and not wanting to step on anyone's toes and wanting to let the movie be its own thing, but also to inject a level of sort of thematic importance of the book and the characters in the book and their contributions and their place as normal on the ground people in the world of Plus Ultra's history.
It's interesting to hear him describe the like concern about, I'm concerned that I want to give this backstory, but I want to make it as open as possible in case they listen to it or they read it and they go, this doesn't match up with what we wanted to do. This doesn't match up with it at all. Then he can go, oh yeah, it was some early version that like didn't work or whatever. Like, I just sort of love that like inspired mindset around how big this could have been and how like, there's just this element to me of it's easy to look back on 10 years ago and go, okay, you've got this pretty, defined sort of fixed thing that happened. But when you talk about how there's not a process, it's also, you don't know how big or small it is when you're in the middle of it. You're like, is this going to be the biggest thing? Is this going to be the tiniest thing? Is this going to be, and I think that what I love about hearing that is that it's like, oh man, they were all dreaming so big. And isn't that great? And I think that, thinking about the sort of parallelisms with how projects and things, I'm not saying there's a ton of pessimism in the work that people do today, especially in the entertainment industry. I don't think so. But I also think that there's not necessarily this scope and vision of, this could be the biggest thing. There was that time period too with entertainment and its thriving nature and the ambition. I mean, I remember how everybody laughed when Cameron and Landau said, well, we've got one, Avatar movie and we've got 4 sequels that like we're ready to go with. We know the story. We know what we're going to do with it. And like, I love that element of hearing, like, in sort of the same vein of like, no, he was also kind of dreaming big by saying, I don't want to step on the toes of what they did. I just want to provide a backstory.
Well, yeah, and it's clear that that ambition was not just reflected by the creative team, but going back to clips, hearing him talk about Disney Publishing saying they want to do something a little different for this. Is there something other than just, the junior novelization and the reading books and all that? Can we do something a little bit different? And at that time, so this would, if that conversation had happened around 2013, 2014, to me, the most recent example that was sort of evidence to that publishing department's ambition was Tron Legacy. And
Yeah, 100%.
you know, this might have ended up being a book, but that one was actually a graphic novel that I call an interquel. It took place between Tron and Tron Legacy, and it told a really essential part of the backstory of that film, and it was not an adaptation. And the truth is, you can always go and do the adaptation, but to also do the ambitious thing, to also do the thing that gives context. And I like to think that that is sort of a companion project. The Tron Betrayal was the title of that one. Still worth a read if you haven't dug into that one. And you will notice things in the film that you would not notice if you had not read the graphic novel. In the same way, I think you notice things about Tomorrowland after you've read Before Tomorrowland. And continuing that train of the connection to the film, Haston, you had a specific question that I'll remind you, you asked Jeff a question, didn't
I
you?
did. So at that time, I was really, I was thinking about the parallelisms between the book and the animated short, and just how you had this sort of trifecta of, you had Clara's sketch, you had the female draftsman in the animated short, drawing it up, and then you had Casey in the Greyhound bus doing her own drawing of what she had seen from the pin preview. And so I had asked Jeff about that.
Reverse engineering.
Right.
Yeah, that's just all. Yeah, that's all. Again, the whole business of making the Tomorrowland mythology is this weird dance of creating mythology for us. Because as Damon and I, and then Damon, Brad and I were brainstorming the movie, we would ultimately need to know stuff about our world to solve storytelling problems. So yeah, we were actively building this mythology throughout the process, but without trying to be beholden or enslaved to it too. So when we finally got our movie, then there needed to be another version where we kind of go back to our mythology and say, okay, well, this is our movie now. Let's fine tune the mythology to support like the finished version of the movie that we have. And then when it came time to write the book, I had to make sure that whatever I did was beholden to the mythology that we ultimately decided upon that supported the movie and the movie itself. So yeah, some sort of like great little synchronicities like that wasn't an expression of like original intention moving forward, but rather were just opportunities looking back after the fact of like, okay, in this, because like the book of Tomorrowland, even though while the seed of the story, the general idea of the story was brainstormed while writing the movie, ultimately details like that we came up with those while writing the book, which happened after writing the movie.
It's all getting in the weeds now of the process of you start with an idea, it's happening in parallel, and then you vault it. Because look, the movie was changing as well. As the reshoots were occurring, as edits were, what would be mentioned in the film, what wouldn't be mentioned in the film, I would imagine that was coinciding to a certain degree with the last minute little edits. And yeah, you can have the broad strokes of the story, but then those little grace notes where you say, we have an opportunity for a visual echo. As George Lucas always says, it's like poetry, it rhymes.
It's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
Like, I think what is so fun about that storytelling process, right, is that as a consumer of this thing, I don't get to see behind the scenes, and I could 100% see, pessimistic Haston being like, well, okay, that makes sense. They shot a film, they came up with some ideas for a scene. Jeff said, well, we probably should like put some of these callbacks in the book or whatever else. But what's so fun is that when you get to consume it in the moment, none of that matters. And so you're sitting there in that theater and you've read that book with that like Clara sketching, and then you look up and you see, oh, Casey sketching, oh, just like Clara in the book. And it's so fun in the moment. And it's like that to me is just the magic of storytelling is it's like these formats and these medias and the way they're released, it's like we have drifted towards this idea of, oh, well, there has to be this master plan for something, right? We saw this with the Star Wars sequels. People like, oh, there needed to be this master plan in order for it to work. But I think that what I loved about hearing that anecdote and hearing it today is just this idea of, oh, but see, even though that's the way the behind the scenes works, it's not disappointing because I got to enjoy it in its three layers when it happened and still get to enjoy it in its three layers when it happened, no matter how it was made. Those great echoes, those great callbacks. And so that's what's great about this. That's what's great about storytelling and about the process.
A very strange reality to be living in where the audience has become savvy enough that they think that they have a window into the process to the level that their enjoyment they think is contingent upon a certain process being the impetus for what they're seeing on the screen, when really all artists have all different kinds of processes, and you as an audience member are either going to connect with the results of that process or you're not. And so from the audience end of this, yes, it's educationally very interesting as a piece of historical ephemera to learn how something was made, but your relationship with the work of art is sacred. I'm a Roland Barthes guy. The audience is the prime interpreter and the author is dead. And ultimately, your experience is the only thing that matters. Art is about a relationship between you and this thing. Ultimately, all that matters is the creative decision that was made. Are you able to have a relationship with that creative decision as an audience member or not? How that creative decision was arrived at is completely immaterial to your relationship with it. And yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because it is a very modern frustration and it is refreshing to hear artists talk candidly about their process because nowadays, the way people talk about how they consume art like this, I can only see the inevitable result being artists be less willing to talk about their process. And we have lost an educational resource in that sense because we need to know the truth of what leads up to the creation of these things for the sake of future artists, for the sake of future audiences, for the sake of everybody. But at the end of the day, you can't peek into an alternate universe like in Tomorrowland. You can't see, oh, well, if they had a master plan, I would have liked it better. What if I told you you would have liked it worse? What if I told you the chaos of iterative creation was the only reason you got anything that you liked at all? And that ultimately, an artist, in the moment they're creating something, has to make the best decision they can within the context that they're in. And if that means letting go of a previous plan, doesn't matter when that decision was made. It matters what's the right decision for the piece of creativity. And I really wish people could wrap their minds around this because having a plan and sticking to it is just stubbornness and it's not inherently a virtue. If it is a good plan that proves useful in the moment the piece of art is being made, fantastic. If it's not, go with the better idea. The better idea must always win no matter who comes up with it and no matter when they come up with
And this goes back to the point that you just made about our conversation with Brad Bird and how the movie will tell the story that it wants to tell. This is the same thing, the iterative process. We're at this time period where people also don't pretend like they are iterative in their own daily lives. And a lot, and it's like we are. And we are human and we are, we are faulty and we have challenges and like, but the ability for like, for the storyteller to go, I can adapt, I can make it feel connected, I can make it, that to me is, is half the fun.
And what's more Tomorrowland than that? Tomorrowland is this ultimate celebration of the scientific process itself. And what is that in thematic terms, if not the acceptance and transcendence of failure? We must let ourselves fail. We must allow ourselves to have a hypothesis, to test that hypothesis, and then to adapt based on what we learn from those observations.
I mean, I don't want to turn this into a rant.
Please.
I think that this brain rot came from this idea that Feige and the first couple phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe were these expertly planned out, interconnected series of stories where like nothing could go wrong and like everything else, right? And I find it so funny that we are now on the back half of this and like the stories aren't really landing. They're modifying things as they go along and trying to make it work and whatever else. And the audience can tell that. And it's sort of like, well, the audience, in a way, I think, needs an element of like making it up as you go along. And I think that what we're seeing is that, yeah, there was a period of time in which drafting up a plan and doing everything you can to make sure it worked and whatever else that worked. But now we're kind of back into that. You just kind of have to do it ad hoc and grow with it and see how it shakes out.
There's a dark and a light side to that, because the truth is Marvel was never like that. They were making it up as they went
No.
along the whole time.
But the audience thought it was like that. And so now that it's clearly kind of not like that, and it's like, well, we're just trying to make whatever work, there's kind of like you get this double betrayal by pretending like it was that for the first 10 years of this. You've now given yourself an audience who doesn't think that it's like that anymore.
To be generous to the audience that we've spent some time criticizing here, I like to try and translate people's aggression into something that I can understand. And if there is an unmet need here, perhaps it is a desire for structure. That there is a warm blanket that comes with feeling like the entertainment or the art or the mythology has a shape that is harmonious with both your life and the world around you and what you want to learn from it. And so there are many ways that we can express the idea of a story having a comforting shape, of having a structure that you can wrap yourself around in. But that a plan does not necessarily guarantee that. You'd like to think it would. So I just try and translate. When people say that, I try and translate it into my head as they have a desire for structure that they're not detecting. Whatever structure they put into it is being obscured from them somehow. Sometimes I do think that might be on the part of the filmmakers. A lot of the time, I think, not to toot this horn too loudly, it is a media literacy problem where people's ability to engage, it does seem like it takes as little as it has ever taken for an audience member, an individual audience member, to give themselves the excuse to not engage with a piece of art. It seems like because there's so much entertainment, the bar is very low. If it doesn't do this or it doesn't do that, or I have a particular pet peeve or I have a particular desire, they're just going to write off the whole thing and choose not to engage with it. I can't blame them. There's this whole other buffet. But that, when we were talking about the dark side and the light side, I think the dark side of this is art will never be a buffet. And I think that sometimes when I see people talk about Marvel, it does seem like they're not particularly interested in artists and storytellers getting to tell the stories they want to tell. They are looking to be serviced. They are looking to be reacted to, but every audience is this amorphous blob of many different desires and perspectives. Perhaps some people were really keen on those first Avengers movies. I personally didn't enjoy them. And then we come to this phase of Marvel where in the individual movies we're sort of trying to stand alone, and people complained about that. While on the other hand, I was in the audience and thought, finally, we have some interesting cerebral superhero movies being made, and you just never can predict. But you're right, this story starts to emerge. And I almost think that this is an expression of social media and the press more than it is of any kind of organic fandom response. There's just this opinion that starts to linger over everything like a cloud. And people just say, yeah, I guess that is how I'm feeling about it.
I mean, it happened with Tomorrowland. Like, let's be perfectly honest.
Yes. Yes, it did.
It happened with Tomorrowland. You know, we saw the reviews, and the first People reviews were just very like, they didn't spend enough time there. And
and Brad Bird specifically throughout his career has gotten this very strange relationship with a few key members of the reviewing press, where they've developed this narrative about him that he has outright denied. And so people interpret every one of his movies through that lens, including Tomorrowland, even when the movie is kind of, in my mind, let's just say it, they call him an objectivist in the Ayn Rand mold. He denies this in interviews, but then I look at Tomorrowland and I think, this feels like, to me, if you really interpret what's happening in the movie, an anti-objectivist movie. It almost feels like subconsciously he was using Tomorrowland to refute that. And of course, once people have this idea in their head, they just look at this movie as evidence of it further, even though I think it's saying a very different message indeed by the end of the film. But it's hard to know how to get away from a YouTube grift where an easy, quick, isn't this a clever little soundbite to say, becomes the truth, even if no one's doing the homework to find, no, actually, is the thing underneath it actually reflecting what's being said about it?
And let's be honest, 10 years later, this was bad 10 years ago. And now 10 years later, it's even harder. We are at this period of time where the sound bites and the grift and the clickbait and the, the desire for attention and the desire to dismiss as fast as possible. We are at this peak fervor right now, and so I've gotten to the point now where I just say I'm just going to throw out other people's opinions, pretend like the internet doesn't exist, pretend like I never read a review section of an article, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to see things and I'm going to consume things to figure out, do I actually like this or not? And I understand wanting to be part of a general sort of conversation, a general sort of collective. But the truth is that even compared to 10 years ago, the internet is fractured now. The internet is not what it was. The internet is filled with people who care more about you engaging with their content so that they make more money than they do about bringing legitimate discussions about what they enjoy to the surface. And this is true across all media. 10 years ago, Twitter was just a bunch of people talking about stuff. Today, under its current ownership and its current financial scheme, it's like people post angry stuff or against stuff or whatever to make you angry, to make you want to engage with it because they literally get paid for it. The discourse is bad. Ignore the discourse. Ignore what people say. Go out, consume media as you want to consume it. Don't let that opinion, eat at you, because I think that one of the frustrations that I've had enjoying this film for 10 years and this series for 10 years and everything else is that obviously, yes, I've got a strong personal connection to it because of The Optimist and the fact that it brought us together and the fact that this did so much for us. And I get it. I'm going to have a little objective bias there, but that's okay. I get to have that bias. I get to have deeper reasons for why I enjoy something and get to share that with the world. And I think that we've gotten to this weird point where like suddenly it's like liking things on a merit because you like them is not right. You have to come up with this objective reason why it's good. And it's like, no, like what you like, consume what you like, do what you like. Like that's what it's all about.
And that kind of objectivity that people think they're fighting for doesn't exist.
No.
It's an illusion. It actually is subjective. It's just people have grown addicted to the idea of describing their individual connection with something in language that sounds objective, but underneath it, the actual ideas are completely subjective. And so I would hope that people will take the inspiration from this to free themselves from the shackles of the illusion of objectivity. You are a subjective being. Your opinion is completely valid as it is rooted in the text. Obviously, there are more opinions that are more valid than others, hopefully ones that are taking the most amount of these texts into their consideration. You can have an opinion on something that's based on like 1/110th of it, and it's like, yeah, that's a valid opinion for that 1/110th, but for the whole thing, it's not as valid as an opinion that takes all of this in. And in that light of optimism, I would like to ask us one final question here on this anniversary spectacular special celebration. Let's imagine that Tomorrowland was a successful franchise, and there were all these other things that we had seen, the animated series, the sequel films, additional books. Hastin, do we think that Before Tomorrowland was the first example that would be followed by those other expansions? Would this be the inspiration in terms of format and how you tell a story and how you relate to the film? Was this going to be the high water mark for other installments in the Tomorrowland saga?
I mean, I would hope so. I mean, obviously my bias in the future of this being massively successful is story connections to the park and a strong desire of how do we take all these little things in our history and like weave them through this fun. And the great thing is that I can do that. That can be my headcanon. I can do that. I still do that. It's like you can take, I think for me, it's like the future of this and how it would have been expanded in success would have been, how do you get these concepts through these stories, and then what do you do with that? It's like, is there somewhere out there that theoretical trapped in hell Space Mountain movie that's actually about Plus Ultra launching rockets and like finding new worlds and like what that feels like, right? Like I think that there's just the potential for what this franchise could have been is as strong as the potential for what the land could be, not locked into this general idea of like, well, you have to have corporate companies sponsor things and like, tell have it all rooted in truth and whatever else. And I think that there's room there's room for the fantasy here because it's in the books and whatever else. And I think that this is the core concept that Tomorrowland has struggled with from its start, is that it was actually kind of based off of fantasy from the beginning, but people weirdly didn't pretend like it was. It's like a flight to the moon didn't seem possible. We knew we could maybe do it, but it didn't seem possible. Yes, it was always the possible future, but it also always did have a bit of fantasy in it. And I love that the book did. And I just totally see this like, yeah, a future Tomorrowland would have had hardcore sci-fi. It would have had fantasy. It could have had all of these different angles that were just rooted in this, idea of what we got from this book.
And that's directly in line with what Brad Bird was trying to do with the film, as he talks about the fabulistic sort of fairy tale version of science fiction and looking at the future. That would be a brilliant inspiration for those who are working on what the next version of Tomorrowland in the parks are. I suspect there is a team at all times at Imagineering thinking up what a possible new version of Tomorrowland could be. Pessimistically, I worry that that is generally nested within the context of an intellectual property of the moment. But I would hope that we eventually reach a future where the creative minds behind whatever Tomorrowland in the parks becomes feel free to incorporate the mythology of Plus Ultra, and that we as artists do not have to feel like we can abandon mythologies that don't necessarily find their audience initially. If the idea is complementary, use it. There is a general stigma against, well, that movie sort of underperformed, we're not going to use the mythology. Don't abandon the mythology. The mythology isn't the reason that that movie underperformed. There's a lot of very interesting things you could do if you took the inspiration of both Tomorrowland the movie and Before Tomorrowland the book in how you would reimagine the parks as not necessarily the Meet the Robinsons were already there. What would a Tomorrowland in the parks look like if it was thematically rooted in the idea of yearning for the future and the fight for the future? What if the fight for imagining what the future looks like and the inherent conflicts that come with it was the idea? And what if you allowed yourself that as the base canvas for a future Tomorrowland in the parks? We asked a similar question with less of a parks emphasis, but just generally about Before Tomorrowland and the idea of future potential expansions to Damon Lindelof. We've been hearing from Jeff Jensen, but we also talked to Damon Lindelof back in 2016. So as the final word in this wonderful anniversary celebration, let's hand it over to Mr. Lindelof.
Sure. I mean, I think that we have to accept the pragmatic realities of the marketplace, as it were. We spent a tremendous amount of time and energy building this world, and it would certainly be exciting to play in again. And I really think that there is there. Maybe years from now, we'll effectively sort of unpack the mistakes that were made or the things that we did right and find a way to kind of revisit it in an interesting way. My desire to go back into that realm again, it definitely exists, particularly in the area of, Jeff constructed these great elaborate backstories, some of which appeared in Before Tomorrowland, the book that he co-authored, just relating to, the disappearance of Amelia Earhart or things that alluding to things that happened in World War II that Plus Ultra may have been involved in. And I kind of feel like that's really fertile, innovative ground for storytelling. I haven't really let myself go there because I think the likelihood of getting to tell those stories anytime soon is relatively slim.
As ever, though, Hastin, we remain eternal optimists, and where there is interest, perhaps there will be an opportunity for a return, if not for the 10th anniversary, for a future anniversary. We are patient fans, and whether it be from fan fiction, if there are any fan fiction authors listening, we would love to hear your stories, or if it comes in some kind of official way. I promise you, listeners, Hastin and I will always be on the lookout for any even slightest mention or allusion to the mythology of Tomorrowland, and we hope that if you find any, you'll send us those as well.
Well, what a great anniversary episode. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, maybe fan fiction that you've written, anything, fan art, send it to us. We're on Blue Sky, we're on Instagram. You can also just drop us an email to press@tomorrowlandtimes.com. That's PRESS at tomorrowlandtimes.com.
We would like to thank everyone for joining us and following along on the Before Tomorrowland Book Club, and as always, for visiting Tomorrowland Times, which we will keep alive as long as humanly possible to ensure that there is always a place where dreamers can stick together. Happy 10th anniversary, Hastin.
Happy 10th anniversary.
Was there anything else that was planned but we didn't get to, or maybe we will get to one day, that continues the story of the universe of this movie?
Well, I would hope so. There's nothing concrete right now.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, it all hinges on this movie finding purchase in the culture, people being fans of it. And if people like it enough and feel like they want more story, we certainly have more story to give them. I think you've gotten a little taste of that in the book. Some of that fed into The Optimist.
Yeah.
I loved all of those expressions of our backstory. There's a lot more where that came from. But you know, it's a tricky dance because you don't want to like flood your perspective, like the viewer, with too much backstory and too many mixed messages. We want to set them up pretty nicely for the film. So we have a ton of backstory. We have a ton of stuff that we would love to tell people. We want to kind of like be careful with it and just like let the movie kind of like find a life and inspire people, and then we should be so lucky to be able to tell them all.
Well, thanks so much. We appreciate that.
I love what you guys are doing.